I had always prided myself on being the steady one in the family. I was Madison Walker, a 30-year-old financial advisor, successful in my career, independent, and focused. I had worked tirelessly to build a solid financial future for myself. I had always been the responsible daughter, the one who quietly played second fiddle to my younger brother, Ethan, whose every whim seemed to take precedence in our family. As the golden child, he was always the one to be showered with attention, praise, and financial support. I had long since accepted my place in the family dynamic. That is, until today. It started like any other morning in Charlotte, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air the moment my mother opened her mouth. She had that tone again, the one that made me feel as if I was a child again, a child with no say in anything that mattered. You need to give your brother your savings for his wedding. He deserves it more than you do. I froze. My coffee cup felt heavy in my hand, and for a moment I wondered if I had misheard her. But no, her eyes never wavered from mine, her words cold and calculated, just as they always were. My father, Robert, sat across from me, his face buried behind his morning newspaper, avoiding the confrontation as he always did. I knew then that I was on my own in this fight. "What do you mean?" My voice was barely a whisper. I could feel the weight of my savings, the fruit of years of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice, crushing me from the inside. "Those are my life savings, Mom," I said, my voice growing steadier, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "I've worked hard for years to build that up." She waved her hand dismissively, her lips curling into that practiced, dismissive smile. "Madison, be reasonable. Ethan wants a destination wedding in the Bahamas. His fiancée, Rachel, comes from a respectable family. The Bennetts are known for their extravagant parties. We need to show them we're of the same caliber." I glanced at my father, silently pleading for him to say something, anything to back me up. But he didn't. He just turned the page of his newspaper, his silence louder than any words could have been. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, though a wave of frustration was rising inside me. "I have over $85,000 saved up. That's not just pocket change. It's my future, my security." My mother's expression didn't change. "And what are you saving it for, Madison? You don't even have a boyfriend, let alone a fiancé. Ethan's found someone, and he deserves a beautiful wedding." The words stung. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how she always dismissed my needs, my desires in favor of Ethan's. Always him, always the golden child. I tightened my grip on my coffee mug until my knuckles turned white. "I can't believe you're asking this of me," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "Do you ever think about what I deserve? Or is it always just about what Ethan needs?" Finally, my father lowered the newspaper, his eyes flickering toward my mother, before he muttered, "Deb, maybe we shouldn't—" But my mother cut him off with a sharp look. "Robert, stay out of this," she snapped, her eyes turning back to me. "Madison needs to understand her responsibility to this family." I felt my throat tighten as her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Family helps family," she said, her face hardening. "Or are you too caught up in your own little world to care about your brother's happiness?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of them. Not now. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound harsh in the thick silence. "I need time to think about this," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt inside. But what my parents didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had recently discovered a secret about my mother, one that would shake the very foundation of our family, a secret that would not only ruin Ethan's perfect wedding, but tear apart both the Walker and Bennett families' carefully crafted facades. I left my parents' house that morning, my mind racing. I drove straight to my office at Morgan Stanley, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Ethan had always been the center of our family's universe. He was always the one who needed the most. When he wanted to attend private school, my college fund was drained to make it happen. When he crashed his first car, my savings bonds were cashed to buy him a new one. Each time my mother had justified it. "Ethan needs this more than you do, Madison." The favoritism had only grown stronger since Ethan started dating Rachel Bennett 6 months ago. The Bennetts were a family of old money, They were the type of people who held extravagant parties, hosted charity galas, and had buildings named after them. Thomas Bennett, Rachel's father, owned half the real estate developments in Charlotte, while his wife, Patricia, chaired 3 philanthropic boards. My mother, desperate to prove we belonged in their social circle, was willing to do anything to impress them. I sat at my desk at work, mindlessly scrolling through client portfolios, my thoughts too scattered to focus. The irony of it all hit me like a slap in the face. Here I was, a financial advisor, someone who helped people make smart decisions with their money, and yet my own family was asking me to give it all away for a wedding that wasn't even mine. "You okay?" My coworker Na asked, her voice full of concern. I glanced up and gave her a weak smile. "Just family drama," I muttered, trying to brush it off. Na raised an eyebrow. "The same Ethan who borrowed money from you last year for his business venture and never paid you back?" she asked, her tone pointed. I nodded, the memory of Ethan's failed food truck venture still fresh in my mind. I had lent him $155,000 for it, thinking he might actually make something of himself. But the business failed, and I was left with nothing but an empty promise. "I saw your mom at the country club last weekend," Na continued casually. "She was having lunch with Thomas Bennett. They seemed friendly." My stomach clenched at her words. If only Na knew just how friendly they really were. The week dragged on, but my mind kept replaying the text messages I had found last week, the ones that had been sent between my mother and Thomas Bennett. I'd never intended to snoop, but something in my gut told me that something was off. That night I found myself staring at the text thread on my phone, the words searing into my brain. It started innocently enough. My mother had invited me over to help her with the wedding guest list, asking me to compile it on a spreadsheet, something she could have easily done herself, but she insisted. As I sat at the table, my mother's phone kept buzzing with notifications. At first, she checked each one immediately, but after the 4th or 5th message, she seemed to grow nervous and excused herself to use the bathroom. I looked at the screen preview of the latest message. "Missing you already," it read, and the name of the sender made my blood run cold. Thomas Bennett. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it was wrong, but something inside me told me I had to. I opened the message thread with trembling fingers. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Months of messages, secret meetings at the country club, rendezvous at Thomas's private office downtown, plans carefully orchestrated around family gatherings and wedding planning sessions. The affair had been going on for months, long before Ethan and Rachel had even gotten engaged. It was all there, the proof that my mother had been using the wedding as a cover for her affair. A week later, my mother's demand for my savings made even more sense. She wasn't just trying to impress the Bennetts. She was trying to ensure that her affair with Thomas Bennett could continue, masked as part of their grand, perfectly planned wedding. The lavish wedding wasn't about Ethan and Rachel's happiness. It was about her own twisted agenda. I looked at her text that evening, asking if I had made a decision about the money. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my response. "You're right, Mom. Family helps family. I'll do it." Her reply was swift. "I knew you'd make the right choice. This wedding needs to be perfect. Perfect. If she only knew what I had planned for her perfect wedding." The Bennett estate was everything you would expect from old money. Sprawling across 3 acres in Myers Park, Charlotte's most exclusive neighborhood, the mansion gleamed in the late afternoon sun. As I pulled up to the iron gates for the engagement dinner, my stomach churned. This was it. The mansion's grand foyer was filled with guests when I arrived, glittering chandeliers, servers carrying trays of champagne, the hum of polite conversation. I spotted my mother immediately, wearing a brand new expensive dress, greeting guests with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Madison, darling," my mother exclaimed as she spotted me. "I'm so glad you came to your senses about the wedding budget." I forced a smile, trying to hide the disgust rising in me. "Actually, Mom, I wanted to discuss that with everyone." The moment my words hung in the air, I could feel the tension building in the room. My mother's face faltered, the perfect mask she always wore slipping just for a second. "Oh, Madison, there's no need to bring it up tonight," she said, her voice tight. But I could see the unease flashing in her eyes. She didn't know what I was about to do. "No, Mom," I replied firmly. This is exactly the time. I spotted my father chatting with a few guests near the fireplace, his awkward posture telling me he felt just as out of place as always. He looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, the weight of our family's secrets settling heavily on him. But this time, I wasn't about to let him stay silent. With one final glance at my father, I made my way toward the center of the room, my eyes locking with my mother's. Ethan sat smugly at the head of the long table, his smile barely contained. He must have been already counting the money in his head, how much he would gain from my sacrifice. It sickened me, but it gave me the fire I needed to carry out my plan. I waited until everyone had settled into the dining room, the chatter becoming a soft hum as servers placed their courses before them. The room was full of Charlotte's elite, their conversation momentarily pausing as they noticed me standing at the head of the table, champagne glass in hand. "I'd like to make an announcement about the wedding budget," I said, my voice calm but steady, rising above the murmurs. I could feel the eyes of every guest in the room shift toward me. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to something darker, her eyes narrowing, as if she were trying to calculate just what I was up to. "No, Madison," she said, her voice trembling slightly with anger. But I wasn't about to let her stop me now. "This is exactly the time, Mom," I said again, my voice firm. "You asked me to contribute my entire life savings of $85,000 to make sure Ethan and Rachel have their dream wedding. You said it was my family duty to help. So, I've thought long and hard about this, and I've decided that does matter." I pulled out my checkbook, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. The silence in the room grew deafening as all eyes turned to me. I began writing out a check. "I'm willing to match whatever amount the Bennetts are contributing. Dollar for dollar," I continued, the words flowing freely now. "So here it is." I handed the check to Ethan, who stared at it in disbelief. It was for exactly $25,000, the exact amount the Bennetts were supposedly contributing. "There you go, brother," I said, my voice cold. "A fair and equal contribution." My mother's face turned a shade of crimson I hadn't seen before. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out at first. Her cheeks flushed with anger and embarrassment as the weight of my words settled in. But that's not what we discussed," she sputtered, her voice rising in fury. "No, Mom," I interrupted, cutting her off before she could continue. "You discussed taking everything I had without any regard for my future. But that's not happening. Not anymore." The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention on me. I didn't need to look around to know that the guests were uneasy, unsure of what to make of this disruption. But as I stood there, I felt something shift in me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the obedient daughter. I wasn't the one who quietly bowed to the expectations of my family. I was finally standing up for myself. "I love my brother, and I want him to have a beautiful wedding," I said, my voice still steady, though the adrenaline surged through me. "But I won't be manipulated into bankrupting myself just because you think it's my responsibility to provide. This isn't happening." The murmurs began to ripple through the room. I could see Patricia Bennett, who had been watching quietly, glancing at my mother with newfound interest. She had always admired her wealth and status, but now the realization was sinking in. Madison wasn't the quiet, obedient daughter they had hoped for. My father, Robert, had been silent until now, but he finally looked up from his plate, his expression softening. It was the first time I'd seen him smile in what felt like forever, and for a brief moment I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Maybe he was waking up to what had been happening in our family all these years. Patricia broke the tension. "Well, Madison," she said smoothly, her voice laced with polite indifference, "I think that's a very generous contribution. Now shall we discuss the seating arrangements?" But my mother wasn't done. As the conversation shifted, she grabbed my arm, her grip tight and painfully possessive. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" she hissed through clenched teeth. "After everything I've done for you." I stared her down, unflinching, as the anger inside me began to cool. "Trust me, Mom, this isn't the kind of embarrassment you need to worry about at this wedding." She glared at me, but I could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed image. For once, she wasn't in control. The week leading up to the wedding was a whirlwind of last-minute preparations. But the atmosphere in our family had shifted. My mother, once the matriarch who controlled everything with a cruel hand, was now openly hostile. Her manipulation tactics no longer had the same power over me. She tried to guilt-trip me, but I didn't flinch. Instead, she threw more tantrums and tried to turn my father against me. But Robert had started to notice things that had always been just beneath the surface. I found myself at Rachel's bridal boutique for her final dress fitting. My mother and Patricia were there, obsessing over every detail of the dress, while Rachel stood quietly in front of the mirror, adjusting her veil. My heart ached for her. She had no idea just how deep the deception ran. Suddenly, Patricia caught me alone, while my mother was busy with Rachel. "Madison," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to keep her composure. "I need to ask you something." I turned, my stomach knotting. "What is it?" "The late-night phone calls, the private meetings about wedding details. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Patricia's eyes searched mine with a quiet desperation. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to say. Should I tell her the truth? Should I share everything I had discovered about her husband's affair with my mother? But before I could respond, my mother appeared in the doorway, her smile masking the tension in the room. "Madison, darling," she said, as if nothing was wrong. "Rachel needs your opinion on the headpiece." I walked away, but as I caught Patricia's reflection in the mirror, I could see the hurt and suspicion clouding her face. And I knew then that she was beginning to see the truth. About Thomas, about my mother, about everything. That evening, my mother cornered me in the boutique's powder room. Her expression was hard, her voice low but filled with venom. "Whatever you're thinking of doing at this wedding, don't," she warned. "You'll ruin everything for Ethan." "Take what away?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. "Your affair or your perfect mother image?" Her slap was the last thing I expected. The sound echoed off the marble walls, and for a moment, everything froze. "You ungrateful little—" she began. But the door opened, and Rachel walked in, her eyes widening as she saw the scene. "What's going on?" Rachel asked. But my mother quickly switched to her practiced smile. "Just a little mother-daughter disagreement about the seating chart," she said smoothly, though I could see the suspicion in Rachel's eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, and as I walked away, I felt a surge of certainty. The lies were unraveling, and I was no longer going to hide from them. Neither Rachel nor I had ever truly known the depth of what was going on in our families, but now we both knew. The wedding day arrived, and with it, the culmination of everything. The Biltmore ballroom, filled with crystal chandeliers and white roses, looked as grand as ever. Guests filed in, dressed to the nines, thinking they were about to witness the most lavish social event of the season, but they had no idea what was coming. As I stood there watching the guests, my heart pounded in my chest. My mother fluttered around in her champagne-colored dress, playing the perfect mother of the groom. Thomas Bennett stood by the altar, adjusting his tie nervously. Patricia sat in the front row, as elegant as ever, but I could see the suspicion in her eyes. And there was my father, sitting next to her, still unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Rachel and I had planned this moment carefully. The evidence was ready. The screenshots had been printed, each one tucked into elegant envelopes placed inside every third program. We had timed it perfectly. Too early, and they might stop the ceremony. Too late, and they would have time to spin their own version of events. I walked up to the microphone, ostensibly to begin my maid of honor speech. My mother beamed at me, her eyes glistening with pride, probably thinking I was finally falling in line. Thomas Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They had no idea what was coming. I cleared my throat. "Before we continue with the ceremony," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "the bride and I have something important to share with all of you." The room fell silent. My mother's smile froze. Thomas Bennett turned pale. I continued, "If you'll all open the envelopes in your programs, you'll find some interesting reading material about two people in this room who've been using this wedding as a cover for their affair." The rustle of paper filled the ballroom. Gasps echoed through the room as guests began reading the screenshots of intimate messages between my mother and Thomas Bennett. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth as she read the evidence of her husband's betrayal. My father sat frozen, his face drained of color as he realized the truth about his wife. The moment the room erupted in chaos, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. My mother's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I had done what I thought was impossible. I had taken control of my own narrative. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of my family's expectations crushing me. I wasn't the obedient daughter anymore. I wasn't the one who sacrificed for everyone else. I had chosen to stand up for myself, and it felt like a victory I didn't even know I needed. Ethan stood at the altar, his face pale as he processed the truth. The perfect wedding he had imagined was now tainted by the wreckage of his family's lies. My mother tried to flee, but she was surrounded by guests who were now aware of everything. Her affair, her manipulation, her desperate attempts to maintain her position in society. The guests who had once praised her, admired her for her social grace and elegance, now stared at her with a mixture of shock and pity. Thomas Bennett, who had stood so confidently beside her, was now paralyzed by the weight of his own guilt. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back for him either. His reputation, built on years of manipulation and deceit, was now in ruins. Patricia, his wife, stood up, her face stoic, but her eyes betraying the hurt she must have felt. She had been living in a world of lies, and now as her marriage to Thomas fell apart in front of her, she had no choice but to face the consequences. And then there was my father. Robert, who had sat on the sidelines for so many years, watching as my mother controlled everything, was finally seeing things clearly. He stood up slowly, as if awakening from a long sleep. I could see the shame on his face, but there was something else there too. Pride. For the first time he was looking at me, truly seeing me, and I knew, despite everything, that he understood what I had done. Maybe he couldn't fix the past, but he was finally present. Finally, he was supporting me. As for me, standing there in the middle of the ballroom, watching the aftermath unfold, I felt no satisfaction in my mother's humiliation. I didn't take joy in seeing her face red with rage or watching Thomas squirm as his life fell apart. What I felt was relief. A weight had been lifted. For years, I had lived in the shadows of my family's expectations, suffocated by the need to be perfect in their eyes. But that was over now. I turned to look at Rachel. She had been a victim in all of this too. Her wedding, her happiness, had been used as a cover for my mother's secret life. And yet, despite everything, she stood by my side. Her strength and her resolve reminded me that no one, not even my own family, could take away my ability to choose my future. I saw the pain in her eyes, but also the recognition that we both had been manipulated by people we trusted. Ethan walked toward me, his face a storm of emotions. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the regret for not seeing the truth sooner, but there was also anger. Anger at my mother, at the lies, at everything that had been hidden from him for so long. I should have listened, he said quietly. His voice was full of regret, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. He had been a pawn, just like me. I didn't see it. I didn't know what was going on. I shook my head. It's not just about seeing it, Ethan. It's about accepting the truth, no matter how painful it is. The wedding was canceled, of course, but what happened afterward was unexpected. My family, the one I thought I would be bound to forever, began to unravel. Ethan, who had always been the one with the world at his feet, now faced the reality of a broken family and a future that was no longer guaranteed. My mother, the woman who had spent so many years controlling every aspect of our lives, was now a shadow of herself. She had no one to manipulate anymore. The guests who had once adored her now avoided her, their eyes full of pity. As for me, I was free from the lies, free from the weight of my mother's expectations, and free from the guilt that had weighed on me for so long. The path ahead of me was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew that nothing would ever be the same. My family, what was left of it, would never be the same. The trust that had been broken could never fully be repaired, but perhaps in time, there could be healing. I could rebuild my life without the fear of living in someone else's shadow. My savings, once just a safety net, now symbolize my independence. My ability to make my own decisions, to take control of my future, was more valuable than anything money could buy. The lesson of this story is simple yet powerful. Sometimes, in order to reclaim your life, You have to face the uncomfortable truths that have been hidden for far too long. We all have moments when we feel trapped, when we feel like we're just going along with what others expect of us. But in those moments, it's important to remember that we have the power to make our own choices, to rewrite our own story. What would you do if you discovered the truth about those closest to you? Have you ever been in a situation where standing up for yourself meant facing the hardest truths? I'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. Share them in the comments below. Let's talk about the power of truth and how we can use it to break free from the chains of others' expectations. The truth might hurt, but it also sets us free.